So the first thing he looked at was line technique. So the way he usually does his hatching, I've done hatching before, but usually the way he does his hatching is that he does start from like a ball like this and then eases it out like this, something as simple as this. Consistent. That's not good. Tries to be as consistent as possible when doing this. And the more you practice this type of hatching, the more you get better at it and improve, and you eventually strengthen your hand control. The next thing about the line technique is your hand direction. So whenever you're doing it, you have to sort of be moving your hand inwards or outwards. You have to experiment to figure out what works best for you. Like with David Finch, for instance, in the video I watched, whenever he was moving his hands was always moving inwards rather than outwards, and this is because he's a lefter, he's left-handed. So you have to try different angles to figure out what works for you, and always turn the page to assist you with the angles essentially. Another thing we're going to talk about is using the line technique on actual forms. So whenever we're looking at 3D forms like cylinders or planes, you have to understand how round or how hard the edges of those planes are. So he did an example where he drew a plane that had both a soft and a hard plane or hard edge. When a plane has a soft edge or hard edge, when the plane has a soft edge, the gradation of light is going to be softer, right? And when it has a hard edge, the gradation of light is going to be harder. It's going to be more abrupt and shorter. So for a plane like this, when you are adding your hatching line after you've put your shadow, because usually he puts his shadow before he then puts the hatching lines, it's going to be softer and it's going to curve following the form of the curve of the plane, following the form of the plane like this. But once it's a hard up edge, it's going to be more abrupt like this, something like this, and it's going to follow the curve. If you try to hatch in a plane where if you use a longer edge to hatch this, it's not essentially going to match it, because it's going to look a bit off, because the edge and the curve is different. If you were to take the plane, but if you were to change the plane of the object to something like this, you see you've made that plane a bit more softer, and it's going to fit with the edge that you're working on. So it's very important to be observant of the form that you're working with, so that you can get better. Now this cylinder, for instance, it has a much more, it's going to have a softer gradation of light, because of also light direction. Understanding light direction is very important, so that you can properly place the object. So the gradation is going to be soft. This is going to be soft like this. So when it's longer, when the hatching lines are longer, it means that the gradation is softer. But then when you take an object like something like a cube, once you take a cube like this, the hatching lines are going to be much more shorter in comparison to the cylinder. So these are important things to note. The form is going to affect the length of the hatching line that you're working with. The next thing we're going to look at is the is the types of lines that we use depending on the effects that we're trying to get. So most basic line usually start with a bit of a ball and then drag outwards from there. So like the one we did in the video from the beginning of the video, most lines usually start out like this. To do this is not wrong, so you could draw a form or a character, and then you could have your shadow like this. You could just use your hatching lines to actually create how light or dark that area is, and then have your hatching lines like this, something similar to this. This is not wrong. This has its own effect, and a lot of artists usually use this. But another way you could also apply shadow generally is that you could just have your form like this, and then get the shape of your shadow. Get the shape of your shadow like this. You get the shape of your shadow, and then you apply your hatching line like this. But in that video, what he did was that he did a shadow like this. He applied his hatching line like this, something like this. By statement of form, what we are looking at is the how round or how soft or how hard the edges of that object is. Another effect would be to use the first basic line but then soften it up at the other end. So I personally have not practiced a lot with this style, but essentially what he's talking about is where you would take your normal hatching line where you have your ball, which is then softened up in the end, and then he will just add a little bit of line towards the end like this, with the hard edge at the middle point. Another technique he uses is to use broken lines, which can create texture in your drawing, and you can cover a large area without necessarily the hatching of that surface looking too heavy. We'll use a cube for instance now. So then he adds a bit of a hatching line like this. You could also break it down like this, the hatching lines like this, and then you could add texture to the cube, which could give it that wall-like effect. Or a piece of fabric, like it's a piece of fabric, something like this, to make it a bit more interesting. You can also take this technique, this broken line technique, and also make it uneven like I did here, to vertically, to kind of make it to give a bit of a broken wall texture, something like this. And then the hatching line is done, and this has added texture to the object and the form that you're applying the texture to. Another thing he mentioned was that when you're starting out with shading, you should try and make the shading simple and basic, meaning that you shouldn't try and bounce the light. You shouldn't try and add any other extra lighting effect whenever you are starting out as a beginner. Like, you shouldn't worry about things like that whenever you're starting out with shading, especially if you're a beginner. And this is because it's going to complicate things for you, because what we're trying to do is that we're trying to focus on learning a particular thing and get better at it before we can then integrate it to anything new. So we have to just focus on the hatching that we're trying to do. So whenever you have something like this and then you have your cast shadow like this, based on the direction of light is coming in like this. One mistake people usually do is that they do render the hatching lines that they have. So they do render their cast shadow. So the rendering should be on the forms, not on the cast shadow, essentially. So whenever they have a cast shadow like this, they begin to render that particular cast shadow, which doesn't look good usually, because it's just a bit weird. The cast shadows are usually hard edges. So whenever you have your form should be the main thing that is being hatched, or being cross-hatched essentially, or rendered. Hatching line is going to be coming out from the shadow, which is sort of showing the gradation. And if there's going to be any hatching lines at all, like since the light is coming from this direction, it means that shadow is going to be at the bottom. And let's just say, ideally it wouldn't look like that, but let's just say this area has shadow, and this is where the shadow is, the hatching lines are going to be coming from, not from the cast shadow like this. Let's take an example with the form of a face. So you have a face like this. So over here we have our cast shadow from the nose. The light is coming from the left, the top left. And then we have our cast shadow over here. And now, this is our cast shadow. This is our cast shadow. And rather than hatching from the cast shadow, you have to hatch from the form. And remember the thing we talked about, understanding how curved or how soft or how hard the edges of the forms you are going to hatch are. It's important in case like this. So like with the nose now, and how hard the light is, the hatching line is going to be, it's not going to be that long, it's going to be a bit short like this. And then with the cheekbones, it's going to be a bit curved like this, also depending on the look of the person essentially. So we're going to have something like this, and then even at this head area, and it's going to give its unique, it's a unique look. So we're going to have our form shadow here. This over here is our cast shadow. Only render into the light with the form shadow. Don't render the cast shadow as well. The cast shadow should just exist on its own, and then the form shadow is going to be what's going to have the hatches. And with line direction, what we are trying to do is that we're basically, especially if you're someone starting out with this type of hatching, for someone like me exactly, that's not like, I'm not really familiar with hatching like that. So whenever you're trying to do this, for it to look neat, a little bit neat and professional, what you can do is that you can use lines, hatching lines. You could use, I said hatching lines, contour lines, to give you a bit of direction, to show you, kind of where the light is going and things like that. So I'm going to do the line direction in different colors. So you could have something like this. Remember, we're following the form of the object. You're going to also do it vertically as well. So something like this, and then something like this, so that whenever you are hatching the lines, you can then follow that tube like this. You can then follow the form of that tube. I'm going to translate this information into working on an arm, because an arm is a much more complex form because it has muscles. So it's going to have edges and things like that, that are a bit more complicated. An arm is basically a much more complex tube. So we're going to take that information and work on it. Just like we did before, because of the angles of the form of this arm, we're going to take that information we had, and then you're going to apply these lines across. So you can see with some angles, the lines are going to have to come like this and then continue like this, and that is because of the form of the muscles essentially, and that is how the hatching lines are going to follow each other like this. You could also do it vertically, something like this. This is this hatching. The information is going to be in your head, like these contour lines. They are going to be in your head, but you are going to apply them. You're going to apply them from memory. You're not going to draw. You can't draw them as guidelines if you're just starting out, for experimentation and things like that. But you don't draw them whenever you're actually working. The form over here is going to be short because of the edge, and essentially this is rushed, but essentially we've applied our hatching lines. And then if you want, you could also apply the vertical ones, the vertical hatching line, for some areas like this. You can apply it to some areas like this. And depending on the texture of what the character is wearing, like if he's wearing like a cloth or whatever, you could always do those broken lines to add texture to the character vertically, both vertically and horizontally. And for something like this, you're essentially taking a simple form. You've taken a simple object like a cylinder or a tube, and you've translated that to a much more complex form like an arm. I'm going to try using those contour lines on the deltoid shape. So with the delts we have our front side and rear delts, and you can then take your contour lines, vertical, horizontal, whatever, and then you could just, because you could do it in different ways. You could do just vertical hatching or horizontal hatching, or you could do like cross hatching. It depends on what you're trying to kind of go for, and sometimes you could be inspired by how strong the shadow is essentially. So we're going to start with vertical hatching lines. Then we're going to do horizontal hatching lines, and then we're going to do cross hatching lines. With the vertical, we're just going to put those first lines that we talked about, like this, something like this, and then you have your hatching lines. The second one is the horizontal. With the horizontal, we're going to follow the contour lines on this other side. And then you can fuse these two together somewhere like. We can then add our horizontal lines like this. Your cross hatching line. He did speak about people like Frank Frazetta and Bernie Wrighton, where they did do their own hatching lines a bit different. Whereas you could have your contour lines go vertically and horizontally, whilst theirs could go a bit more diagonally, essentially. And you can kind of see it directs the light in that kind of. You can do something like this. You can have your shadows, and then you could follow the angle and the direction of the light, kind of like this, to create a different type of hatching effect or hatching line, essentially. So you do something like this, something like this, something like this, or something like this, to kind of create the effects that you're looking for. So you see how we went from simple shape to much more complex form in the form of an arm, and then finally we'll just look at a full body. So we have these figures side by side, and we're going to apply the hatching lines first. So first of all, you have to know where your shadows are going to go, and then use simple shapes and direction to help to figure out your shadow. And then you're going to add the rendering. So understanding the baseline structure of what you are rendering is going to really essentially help you with how the shadow is being applied, how the light and dark interact with each other. And in this case, we are going to use that on an entire figure. So you can render with just hatching lines without necessarily blocking out the shadow. That thing I told you about, where you could just draw your simple shape and then just use your hatching lines like this to just create your shadow. And then or you could just put your shadows in, your hard blocks of shadows in, something like this, and then you could do the transitioning with hatching lines like this. So there are the various ways you could apply it as art. Don't just limit yourself with one technique. Longer lines are going to make your forms softer. So, and then take note of your light direction during this process. So these are very important. So from areas like the face, you can see that the light is sort of coming from this angle. Areas like the face, you add a bit of curved lines like this, because we are trying to follow that form of the cheek, right? If you look at the cheekbone, it's kind of sort of like this, and you can see we have a bit of shadow here because light is coming like this, and this form is a bit rounded. So when you have a curved form, you essentially draw the hatching lines like this, but because there's a lot of light, the lines are not going to be that hard, and then it's going to be a bit lighter. But when you look at this area, because of the shape of the nose, there is a bit of shadow that is coming here, hard cast shadow that is coming here, and then soft form shadows that are like this, because of the cheekbone as well, right? I'm talking about this area here. So then the form shadow, you could then draw from the form shadow like this, and then remember, I don't draw a cast shadow. You just leave it the way it is, and then you could even just do a little bit of this. I'm going to leave it, and you just apply a bit of form shadow over here at the neck. They're not going to be too long. You see that the more you practice this one here is going to be shorter because of the neck, because of the shape of the arm, and there's muscle like this, and then the light is coming like this, so there's going to be a bit of shadow, and because of the form of this muscle over here, the front delts, this other side here, it's the same thing. We're talking about structure. So the shadow is going to come, it's going to come like this, because you're rendering from the dark. It's going to come like this, and then you could add a bit of cross hatching like this over at this area here from our chest over here. The chest is usually roundish, but of course, stylistically, you could decide how you want it to be, but it's not going to be, the shadows, the hatching lines are not going to be long. And you can see how I'm reducing the hatching lines because of the light. It's receding into the light. Same thing over here, just hatching there. And then you could also add a bit of texture. I think we talked about texture, like if he's wearing a clothes, you could add some texture lines here and there to make it a bit interesting and make it look more alive. Then over here, the lines are going to be a bit longer because the lower abs are usually a bit more softer than the upper abs. Like we said, the softer the object, the longer the hatching lines. You could do this area in two different ways. The biceps, you could have it like this, have the light like this, and then add your shadows, your vertical lines like this, and then add horizontal cross hatches like this. But over here we're just going to do a little bit of hatching line, vertical hatching like this, and then lead to horizontal hatches like this. So sometimes what you could do, if you don't really understand how you're going to go about with the hatching lines, you could just just like kind of experiment by taking the form out and then figuring out where you put the light direction, and then try to see how you're going to place the hatching lines. And take note of your line width, because you could just sort of overdo it and make the hatching lines become a bit overbearing, and then it won't look interesting. With this, we've just basically transformed this shadow to this, and you've added a bit of rendering, and it looks a bit more cooler than it did essentially. So that is what I learned from the David Finch video on cross hatching. I have put a link down so you could go and watch the video. It's a video from Proko. You can go and watch the video yourself and see how the master himself mentioned it. If you like this content, please give it a like and subscribe. Keep drawing, stay creative guys, and peace.